The release of a third coronavirus vaccine by Johnson & Johnson has been approved for distribution in the U.S., and it's rekindling the moral question. Should Catholics take a vaccine produced using abortion-derived cell lines? Now, two major U.S. archdioceses are cautioning against its use this week, as well as the United States Bishops' Conference. What is the Church teaching on this ethically complicated subject? Here to help us make sense of it all is Director of Education at the National Bioethics Center, Father Tad Pacholczyk. Father Tad, I'm glad you could join us. My archdiocese here in New Orleans and St. Louis put out statements this week asserting that the COVID-19 vaccine developed by Johnson & Johnson only is morally compromised. And they've asked Catholics to avoid it if they're given a choice. They cite concerns about the use of abortion-derived cell lines in the development and worse, in the production of the vaccine. The Archdiocese of New Orleans wrote, "We maintain that the decision to receive the COVID-19 vaccine remains one of individual conscience in consultation with one's healthcare provider. We also maintain that in no way does the Church's position diminish the wrongdoing of those who decided to use cell lines from abortions to make vaccines. In doing so, we advise that if the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine is available, Catholics should choose to receive either of those vaccines rather than to receive the new Johnson & Johnson vaccine because of its extensive use of abortion-derived cell lines." Now, Father, in December, the Vatican said it is morally acceptable to receive COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses in the research and production process when ethically irreproachable vaccines aren't available. So should Catholics avoid the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Well, so Raymond, this has a little bit of nuance to it. Certainly, if all things are equal, so you have equal accessibility, you have equal efficacy between different vaccine candidates, and other details are largely the same, well then, yeah, you would want to look at using the one that is least associated with cell lines from abortions. But, you know, the real world is kind of more complicated than that. And we find ourselves in a situation where, in fact, accessibility is a big deal. And you can't get all three of these vaccines, or even more than one in many locations. There's also issues here that are really important to consider that are just medical issues. I mean, just to give you an example, I met somebody recently who had an allergy to something called PEG, P-E-G, and it turns out that this is present in the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. So she cannot receive those vaccines. She will get very sick. She'll have an anaphylactic reaction if she is vaccinated with those. So in a case like that, she doesn't have multiple options. She has really only one option currently, which would be J&J. And then, you know, there's one more piece here, Raymond, that I think is also going to sort of alter this landscape with time, and this is all of the discussion around variants, South African variant, you know, variant from the United Kingdom, et cetera.
Right.
That means that vaccines are going to have to be tweaked and tuned, and it means that you are sometimes going to have choices where you're going to realize a better candidate will be the one that is associated with cell lines from abortions. So here, there's a need, as always, to make a judgment of prudence around this question. But as I said at the beginning, if everything is totally equal in all those variables, then yes, that is what would make sense and what the Church would counsel, that we choose the one with the least association with the cell lines from abortion.
Yeah, that's basically what the Bishops' Conference is saying. They're saying, look, it's morally acceptable to get any of these COVID vaccines, but if you can choose the one with the least connection to abortion-derived cell lines, you should choose that. They're clearly stating that if a person can choose an alternative to the Johnson & Johnson, they should. But if not, then I guess you're going to have to take the Johnson & Johnson. But my question is, the way this is being depicted in the media, they're going through great pains to try to pit the U.S. bishops against the Vatican. But, Father, talk to me about subsidiarity. One would think the local bishops should be deferred to in these matters, since it's originating in their dioceses, particularly something as changeable as a vaccine. And to be perfectly candid, and I've not seen this reported widely, there was no Johnson & Johnson vaccine when the Holy See guidance was sent out a few weeks ago, correct?
That's correct. And your point about subsidiarity is well taken. You know, each diocese is going to have a very different profile in terms of, for example, availability and accessibility. So the kind of guidance that comes out from a bishop will be important to the flock, and that really should be kind of the starting point. At the same time, there's this, as you know, delicate dance with larger entities that are also, it's also important that we engage in that. So with, the Bishops' Conference, with the Vatican, it's important that at the end of the day that we all be on the same page on this. And I think some of the distinctions that were made in the recent statement, December 2020, out of the Vatican, were very, very helpful in reminding people about where these lines of obligation fall, that to the extent that it is feasible, one should use alternatives, but it won't always be feasible. And that reality check is always coupled in the Vatican's language with an important emphasis on making sure that end users get out there and express their displeasure, their disapproval, their objection to the fact that these are the kinds of vaccine choices that are present in front of us. We really need to see manufacture of vaccines go in a brand new direction, step away intentionally from the use of these HEK293 and PER-C6 cell lines that came from these abortions in 72 and 85. I mean, why should this
Father,
continue? This is something, it's a scandal.
Let me just stop you there for 1 second and echo something that I've seen and that I'm hearing. I don't see any objection from anybody, from priests, from bishops, or from the laity, saying, we are upset that you are using these abortion lines in the vaccines. All I see is people dancing and doing TikTok videos of themselves getting shot in the arm. Looks like a celebration party to me.
Well, I'm sure there are some people that would fit that description perfectly, but Raymond, I'll tell you, at the National Catholic Bioethics Center where I work, we get routine questions. Do you have a template letter that I can use to write to the pharmaceutical company? I am upset about this. We need more choices. And we see this almost every day. So I think people are waking up to it. And I think, frankly, COVID-19 and the whole pandemic is a blessing in that sense. It is a silver lining that we have to take this moment as an opportunity to change the research culture that we find ourselves in and really steer this battleship in a brand new direction.
Father Ted, many pharmaceutical companies used, as you mentioned, the abortion-derived cell lines in their testing and even in the production. As a moral matter, I want to probe this idea. Where do you draw the line? I mean, if cells derived from, say, euthanized elderly people could save people in the next pandemic, might that be morally acceptable because of the common good? Might you have to take that vaccine?
Well, I mean, that's a very unpleasant scenario, just as unpleasant as the one that we are discussing. And why is it so unpleasant? Because there was no informed consent. Right? That's at the heart of this. You didn't ask that person who was euthanized, and actually, if they were requesting their death, you couldn't get permission from them. But putting that to the side, the fact that they were euthanized and that no informed consent was obtained, that's the fundamental violation, just like for the case of the child. Because if you have a natural miscarriage, mom and dad can donate the tissues from their deceased child, and it's like an organ donation. Doesn't raise any fundamental moral problems. So, these scenarios that you're raising remind us that we're in a situation, we've sort of backed ourselves into a corner using morally problematic sources, and it really is essential that we step out of that corner and start moving in a new way. And I think, part of the challenge here is to raise the volume sufficiently so that researchers and so that pharmaceutical companies are made well aware of this concern.
I know, but sadly, the only moral argument being advanced right now, and it's bigfooting all the concerns you just raised, is if you're a good person, if you're a moral person, you will take this vaccine for the good of others, and that washes any hint of immorality or connection to abortion or others' deaths or anything, frankly. That trumps it all. Isn't that the moment we find ourselves in?
I think it is the moment. You're right. And there's a certain tendency to simplify things down to the lowest common emotional denominator. And if the emotions, make me feel good, oh, I'm contributing to herd immunity. And, there's a certain amount of that will be legitimate and that we need to allow. But at the same time, that cannot be the totality of our thinking about this. It has other levels and subtleties, as we're discussing here and as the Vatican documents remind us. So it's really valuable, I think, for people to get acquainted with these types of distinctions and with what the Vatican has taught on this, and to, mark out a direction forward so that they themselves don't just remain passive participants, as it were, but that they're actively engaged in this very important historical moment that we find ourselves in with the generation of new vaccines. And, the likelihood of a repeat, frankly, Raymond, I think there will be other, viruses in the future that we're going to have to contend with through this vaccine technology. So let's start, beating the drum and getting the word out so that people don't passively engage in these problematic directions.
Yeah, no, I think there has to be also an expansion, I think, in the moral teaching of the Church to consider the complexities and the moral failings of some of these paths that I think we're already down. But I thank you for the clarity, Father Tad. And just to sum up, because I don't want any confusion from people, the Church is teaching that if the vaccine is available, you should take it.
Well, the Church is teaching if the vaccine is available, you should discern whether your circumstances warrant the taking of it. That's the key point. So you have to make a judgment about benefits and burdens and about risk assessment. And so it's not a simple, oh, everybody should take it. No. But if you're in a high-risk category, then you need to look very closely at this. And if you're not in a high-risk category, you will have a little more latitude, as it were, in terms of questions like, should I wait for another iteration of one of these vaccines, et cetera. So it's not a universal call by the Church by any means, but the Church does frame this in terms of, look, vaccines have been a great blessing to public health, and we should acknowledge that and engage in their use in a morally appropriate way.
Yeah. Well, I think the New Orleans and the Bishops' Conference interventions are actually helpful because they invite introspection, moral introspection, as you move toward taking this vaccine or not, and that's a good thing.
No, I agree with you totally. I think this is another fortunate moment for us to kind of get into the particulars, and the statements by those dioceses have certainly assisted with heightening the dialogue.
Father Tad Pacholczyk's commentary and his ethical profiles on the COVID vaccines on the National Catholic Bioethics Center website. They're at ncbcenter.org as well as fathertad.com. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Raymond.